Hey guys, today I wanted to talk to you about a topic that comes up in the shop all the time. This difference between a 20-mile-an-hour bike and a 28-mile-an-hour bike, and more specifically, what might be best for you or somebody else who you might be shopping for. There's a lot of considerations when you're thinking about 20 miles an hour versus 28 miles an hour on an electric bike. One, there's regulations on where you can ride them. Two, there might be some differences in price because there might be some changes in the specifications of bikes. And then also you could just consider, like, what do you actually need? Is it, safer just to have that 20-mile-an-hour bike as opposed to 28 miles an hour? I'm going to cover some of these different topics in more of a general way, but if you have more specific questions, always feel free to reach out. I'll just say from my side, these are some more practical things that I think about when people ask me this question. For one, I think if you're often thinking in your head of whether or not 28, if you're like, I think that I want 28, but I'm not really sure, I'd say you should probably really strongly consider going for it, because it's the sort of thing that you might regret not having it later. I've found that some people have that sort of experience, although I think I generally encourage people to go for 28 if they are considering it. When you don't have it, when you hit that 20-mile-an-hour marker and you feel like you want to pedal beyond that, a lot of times you might feel a bit limited there. But it really depends on your use scenario. One of the details I consider in relation to that is, like, are you using the bike for transportation, commuting, or are you using it for recreation? I mean, I think for the most part, if you're just using it for recreation, 20 miles an hour is fine. Like, you're not necessarily in a rush to go anywhere, but some people might feel like they want that exhilaration of going a bit faster. So that's kind of another consideration in relation to that. If you're commuting though, if you need to get somewhere quickly, if you're kind of contending in your mind, am I gonna take a car or am I gonna take my electric bike? It might make the electric bike a little bit more appealing if you have that 28-mile-an-hour top speed. Some other scenarios that exist specifically in that instance is that, you might be commuting and have to ride with traffic. And in these scenarios, oftentimes if you can ride a bit faster, you might actually be safer if you can ride with the speed of traffic as opposed to riding, much slower. Quite often a lot of cities are moving in the direction of having 25-mile-an-hour speed limits on their inner city roads. And so if you're riding a bike that's capable of 28, you can ride in the lane with traffic, and maybe you won't feel so uncomfortable with the cars, or the cars might more so not feel so uncomfortable, feeling like they have to go around you to speed up. And I know that that's kind of been my experience, and I definitely appreciate that. Some other details, some of the motor systems that are 20 miles an hour oftentimes can have a bit more torque to them in comparison to the motors that are specifically designed to go faster. So this is another important consideration. Say, for example, if you live in a place that has a lot of hills, or maybe you're not as fit, you want the bike to do more work for you, having that 20-mile-an-hour system that potentially has a higher torque level could be helpful in those scenarios. So I think that that's something that people battle with a lot. One of the things that has changed this a little bit recently, especially in our shop where we work a lot with Bosch. So Bosch has this Generation 4 motor system, and it has the same amount of torque as their highest torque 20-mile-an-hour system. So the 28-mile-an-hour system has 75 Newton meters, but the 20-mile-an-hour also has 75 Newton meters, speaking specifically of this Generation 4 speed and CX motor respectively. So when you think about it in those terms, like, oh well, I'm not really necessarily giving up anything with the speed motor, that would be your inclination, but actually the motors are still technically built differently. So the CX motor is built more specifically in the way that the motor is actually wound. It's made to be able to deliver more torque in that low end power, where the speed motor, it is built a little bit differently to be able to deliver more power at the top end. In my experience riding it, when you go over 20 miles an hour, you actually get more power. So it's almost like you get 80% of power below 20 miles an hour and 100% of the power above 20 miles an hour. Whereas with the CX motor, you get 100% of that power in that low end. So I think a lot of people really appreciate that, especially if you're in a very hilly area. But at the same time, I find a lot of people that they don't necessarily use even the highest level of assistance, or if you use the gears more effectively, or if you have a wider range of gears, you can impact that. So if you're starting out in that very low gear with the high-speed motor, you can have a similar effect as you would in one of those higher torque motors. In the past with the Bosch Generation 2 motor, you kind of had to make this trade-off. You would get 63 Newton meters of torque with the high-speed motor or 75 Newton meters with the CX motor. Now both of the motors have the same amount of torque, although as I mentioned before, the way that they're applied is a bit different. So this is, these are some of the topics specifically around the practical application of these different systems. There's other details to consider as well. One of the things to think about is where you can ride them. We're seeing more and more mountain bike trails opening to electric bikes. And for the most part, you're only going to see those open to Class 1 20-mile-an-hour bikes. So the 28-mile-an-hour bikes, technically, you're not really supposed to ride them. I know some people do, but you really got to be careful here. And long term, we don't really know what the rules are going to look like or what the oversight and what the potential repercussions of like breaking those rules are. So it's really something you want to consider of how you're going to conduct yourself in those scenarios. So to put it in simpler terms, for the most part, 20-mile-an-hour pedal assist bikes are really treated largely as bicycles, whereas 28-mile-an-hour pedal assist bikes can be in some jurisdictions considered almost something a little bit more like a moped. For the most part, you can still ride them, in places that you can ride a bicycle, but there are some restrictions. There's certain bike lanes that you can't ride them on, and certain bike trails that you can't really ride them on. Now, I'm just going to be real with you. There's plenty of people that are riding these 28-mile-an-hour bikes where you're not supposed to, and there's kind of a lot of these arguments of like, why are these rules this way? Will they be like this long term? In my mind, to some extent, I think about, you could drive a Ferrari in a school zone that has a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit. Why should you be, limited? I mean, it's really about being responsible, right? But I guess maybe there's this concern. I think there's so much hype around electric bikes and the potential damages and concerns on trails, etc. So people want to be really careful and kind of ease into this thing. So that makes sense. If you are kind of one of those people that are maybe riding in places you're not supposed to, just be really mindful of that, because you can have an impact on the industry as a whole and access as a whole. But in my mind, I'm really appreciative of people that are moving away from a car into a bike, and I think that there's not that much infrastructure out there. So I could see to some extent if there was infrastructure specifically made for 28-mile-an-hour bikes and 20-mile-an-hour bikes, but the idea that all 28-mile-an-hour bikes are going to have to ride with cars, it's maybe not so practical or ideal. I guess the point being, just check with your local jurisdiction or specific trail systems of how those rules exist, how they're enforced. Some other details that might be not as common, but they're still a thing. One, there's less 28-mile-an-hour bikes out there than there are 20-mile-an-hour bikes. 20 miles an hour is kind of the standard, if you will, where 28 miles an hour might be a little bit more special. So if you're shopping for a bike, you're going to have a lot more options if you look specifically at a 20-mile-an-hour system. In our shop specifically, we sell a lot of 28-mile-an-hour bikes. Particularly, we focus on really special bikes that maybe are not as common. So maybe that's part of it. And we have a lot of bikes that are overbuilt. So a lot of those bikes can handle that higher speed a little bit better than maybe some can. And the price of the bikes can vary, because sometimes the equipment on a 28-mile-an-hour bike might be a bit different. Now, in the US, there's not any specific special requirements for 28-mile-an-hour bikes, but in Europe there is. And actually, a lot of these bikes come from Europe, so they're going to probably have specific parts on them that are made for 28-mile-an-hour bikes, which might cost more. For example, the lights generally are going to cost more because they might be brighter. In theory, if you're riding at a faster rate of speed, you need a light that can shine further so you don't, ride beyond it. Some other details in Europe, for example, you're required to have a horn on a high-speed bike. Our general recommendation is if you have a horn, it might be a good idea to have a bell as well, because if you are riding in a bike path or riding in an area where there's pedestrians or other cyclists, having a bell or using a bell is a lot better etiquette than using a horn. I think that could be a bit uncomfortable. although at times having a horn could be really helpful at the same time. Some other details, you might find brake lights on high-speed bikes. That's also a requirement now in Europe. These requirements actually just came on board within the past couple years, but it's becoming more and more common that some of these brands are starting to roll that stuff out, and it really makes sense. It's just improved safety. That's some of the equipment stuff. And speaking on safety, we should really talk about that. Like, what is a safety difference? There is certainly. If you're going 20 miles an hour, you're generally going to be less likely to sustain a really serious injury than if you're going 28 miles an hour. But at the same time, as I shared before, if you're riding with traffic, you might find that going 28 miles an hour, you might actually feel a bit safer because you're not competing with traffic as much. You're actually like riding with the flow of traffic. So there's details on both sides. One other detail, speaking specifically on different regulations, in many places you might actually be required to wear a helmet on a 28 mile an hour bike, and whereas a 20 mile an hour bike, generally speaking, you won't be required, although there are certain places where you're always required to wear a helmet on a bike or electric bike otherwise. Since we're talking about electric bikes, I think it's only natural to talk about battery power and range. And this is a really important factor to consider when looking at 20 and 28 miles an hour, because actually as you go over 20 miles an hour, your range is going to drop off pretty significantly, because you have these forces of wind resistance, road resistance, and all these details are going to have a bigger impact as you go faster. So something to really consider if you're really looking to get the longest range out of your bike, or at least staying under 20 miles an hour is going to be helpful. Like if you went on average 10 miles an hour, you're going to have much better range out of that battery than if you're going on average 18 or 20, and then to go to 25 or so, it's going to be dramatically less. All that being said, I mean, if you have a 28 mile an hour bike and you're really looking to improve your range, you can use a lower level of assistance. You can also stay at that lower speed. All these things are largely within your control, so it just depends what you're looking to do. Some other things, just kind of thinking anecdotally of like what I've experienced talking with customers. Recently I had a conversation with somebody who lived in a very hilly area, and he's just battling between high speed and high torque and not really sure which way to go. Specifically in this instance, we're talking about a bike that has the Gen 4 motor, so both of them have the same amount of torque, but that 20 mile an hour bike has that ability to climb hills a bit more. And his thought in this specific instance was, you know what, one, I'm riding for recreation, so it's not as critical that I go super fast. Two, I have very big hills, so on those very large hills, it's probably not that likely that you're going to go above 20 anyway. And if you're going downhill, it's actually not going to make that much difference. So if you're consistently going up and down hills, you might want to consider just going with 20 miles an hour. You'll have more freedom where you can ride the bike legally, and and you're going to have more torque in those instances where you actually need it. The last detail I wanted to really talk about is the way the motors work maybe after that 20 miles an hour, specifically on the bikes that are limited to 20 miles an hour, because historically there's been motor systems that at 20 miles an hour you find it to be very difficult to pedal beyond that. A lot of the bikes are getting better and better with this specific system in that they're creating as little drag as they can in the motor. So if you go and you pedal to 20 miles an hour, you stop getting assistance, you might have an easier time pedaling beyond that. And now keep in mind, if you go from, you're at 19 miles an hour, you're getting up to 300% assistance, and then you go to 21 miles an hour, you're getting no assistance at that point. So all those forces which are weighing on you become a lot more challenging to you. So in theory, you almost have to like shift down a gear in order to keep the same sort of speed and cadence and momentum there. I think that I pretty much covered all the details that I wanted to. Certainly, if you have any questions about this, leave them in the comments below or reach out to us. We're always happy to help. I hope this video is helpful to you guys if you are considering between these two different systems. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you in future videos, and feel free to make any requests for some of them too. So we'll see you soon.